Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. I'm honored to be joined today by President Salome Zourabichvili, the president of Georgia, whose country was invaded by Russia in 2008 in what many analysts believe was a precursor to the invasion of Ukraine that we're witnessing now. Madam President, thank you for joining us today on Washington Post Live.
Hello. I'm very glad, and thank you very much for having me in this.
So, Madam President, I know that you've just come from the memorial service at the Washington Cathedral for former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright was a believer in women and leadership. I want to ask you a personal question to start. What do you think Madeleine Albright would have said today about the situation in Ukraine and Russia's invasion?
I think that she would have, as she had done all her life, she would have been on the side of freedom, of democracy, and of resilience. I think that's the story of life as a refugee that fled fascism at her time, and that all her life has continued to fight for freedom and democracy, and for also women leaders. So I think that this is the time for her where probably the world would have needed leaders like that more even. And I think that we should continue this legacy and never accept that a country in the 21st century be aggressed, invaded the way Ukraine is today, the way its population, civilians, women and children are being treated, and their inability until now to choose their alliances, which is the main part of what the independence means.
I'm sure that Secretary Albright, were she alive, would salute your courage and thank you for your journey to the United States and so speaking so clearly about the situation. I want to ask you about the latest developments in the Ukraine war. Over the last several days, we've had disruptions in Transnistria, a breakaway area in Moldova that are reminiscent to me of what happened in Georgia in 2008. I want to ask you whether you see this as a provocation that might be a pretext for an aggressive Russian move along the Ukrainian coast towards Transnistria and Georgia, and if so, what the West and Black Sea neighbors should do about this.
Well, I think these are manipulations for the time being, the type of which we know Russian has been in the habit of using in putting pressure. And clearly what's happening today in Moldova is, for the time being, an indirect pressure through Transnistria on the Moldovan government in order to stir fears among the population. On our side, also, Russia has been playing with the separatist occupied territories, and they have been claiming that they want to hold a referendum to be reunited to Russia. So all of that is really playing on the nerves of both Moldova and Georgia, which are the two countries that are the closest to Russia, that are in the same trio as Ukraine, wanting to join NATO and the European Union, and that are not protected by either the NATO Article 5 or by the European Union direct solidarity. So clearly it's a vulnerability, but I think that it means that we should get more attention, more support. Clearly, the focus has to be Ukraine. The direct support has to be Ukraine, but we should not be forgotten. And that is the sense of my trip to Washington, this time together with wanting to be present for the ceremony for Madeleine Albright, which I knew personally. It is also the time that I choose in order to send this message that Georgia should not be forgotten, that if it appears in Moscow that there is less attention towards either Moldova or Georgia, that might be a temptation for the Russian leadership to turn its attention toward those two countries.
Madam President, let me ask you frankly first whether you think Georgia may be next as a target of President Putin's attacks, and second, what specifically you've asked President Biden and the administration to do to help Georgia avoid that possibility.
Well, first of all, I would never say that I fear that will be next, because you should never prejudice the future, and I don't want to make that kind of prognosis. I just say that we should be careful. We should not lose the attention of both our European partners and our American partners. So the main call that I'm making in Washington is for Georgia to be more present in the way the administration speaks about the issues, in the way the administration has been attentive to the developments in our region. Of course, it means that we would need also more support. That means the support in terms of the allocation of resources, which is now in the process of being debated. Georgia Support Act, it's something that we're clearly very thankful for. Support for the new path towards European integration that the European leadership has been opening for Ukraine and for Moldova and Georgia. These are the answers to any form of challenge that or threat that Russia might pose to our country, or in that case, to Moldova.
One question as we look at Russian activities in the southeast of Ukraine is whether the Russian military is strong enough to move its campaign west towards Odessa and Moldova. I want to ask you what your judgment is as you and your advisors in Georgia have watched the Russian military so far. What assessment you'd make about its performance? It's been a surprise to many here in the United States how poorly the Russians have done. Do your generals and advisors feel the same way?
I think everybody has been wrong in making predictions about how strong Russia would perform in Ukraine. Everybody, including Russia, has been wrong on how they could perform. So all the calculations were wrong, and Ukrainians have proven that when you're defending your own territory, your own country, you are fighting much more efficiently than when you're invading and you don't know, and that's the case of the Russian soldiers, you don't know for what reason you're invading that country which has been described to you as being a brotherly country. So all the calculations were mistaken. Now we don't know the second phase, which is centered now more in the east and southeast of Ukraine, how it will go about. But clearly, there too, the calculations are not that correct, because this massive aggression towards more centered on the east is not proving either to be very successful. We all hope, and especially in Georgia, that it won't be successful, and especially the attempts to go towards Odessa and towards Transnistria, which would mean that Russia could take control of that whole shore of the Black Sea, and that would be very preoccupying, and very preoccupying not only for Georgia, but I would say for the European Union and for all our partners, because clearly the Black Sea is a strategic strategic for all our future plans of transit, of energy transit, and not only energy, but also all the communication connectivity lines that are the big plans for this century. These are connections, cooperation. These were the plans for the 21st century, and not a new war and confrontation that Russia has been starting as if we were somewhere in the 20th century.
You've been outspoken, Madam President, as today in our conversation in your criticism of Russia's actions, but not everyone in Georgia is willing to speak out in the same way. You've gotten some criticism from what I read from your own governing party after some of your statements, and you made a comment in an interview last month with National Public Radio that caught my eye. I just want to read it to you and ask you if you'd elaborate. You said, "We're in this dilemma of not confronting Russia, not provoking Russian reactions, but at the same time keeping our principles, which is solidarity with Ukraine, which is our closeness with the European Union and NATO." Could you describe that dilemma and tell us whether you face efforts by Russia internally in Georgia to make difficulty for your positions?
Well, you know, it's very clear that when a country has gone through the war that we had with Russia in 2008, and that's not the only one, we had war in 1991, 92, right after the independence, when Russia used the separatist forces against the newly independent Georgia. That was the case in 1921 during the first independence of Georgia, when my family had to flee Georgia under the Russian occupation. So it's not very new. And for a country that is occupied, that has 20% of its territory that is occupied, it's clear that we cannot afford to start confrontation, to provoke, to be in any way responsible for Russia trying to again attack our independence or our territory. But again, our history, the 26 centuries of Georgian history, state history, means that you cannot renounce your principles, that if you do so, then you lose your independence, you lose your identity. And Georgia has been able for 26th century to preserve this identity, this territory, its face, the Orthodox faith, and all of that is what makes Georgia. So it's a difficult line, and sometimes maybe we do not have exactly the same wording between the government and myself to find this line of balance. But I think that all in all, Georgia is very united. The Georgian population is 100% united in its solidarity with Ukraine, because it understands that this solidarity with Ukraine is also a solidarity with our own principles, with our history, and with our defense of our independence today.
Let me ask you, Madam President, to speak a bit about President Putin of Russia. You have a unique perspective, being a neighbor and having been subject to Russian aggression. Give us your sense of Putin, how he thinks about the use of power, and if you would, it's often questioned in this country whether Putin is a rational actor, and I'd be interested in your judgment about that, whether Putin acts in rational and predictable ways.
Well, first of all, I have to make it very clear that I never met him. We do not have diplomatic relations with Russia, so I do not have a direct contact in order to be able to make a close judgment. What I can say that I am also probably the only example in the recent past of a country that was able, and I was then in charge as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to negotiate an agreement with Russia on the withdrawal of Russian military bases, with my counterpart, which was and is Sergei Lavrov. And that was the only agreement that was to its end and was respected by Russia. So there was a time when President Putin, who probably gave his agreement to that, was rational. Whether today one can see rational in the way that Russia is behaving, I would not judge the personality, but as a country, the behavior of Russia does not seem to me rational, because it had and it has much better chances of developing its own national interest, its economy, the situation of its population through cooperation with the European Union that has been trying to do that, through cooperation with the United States, and through finding with its neighbors a relationship of close neighborhood that is very different from creating enemies all around you by invading their territories. And that is really not needed, because none of these countries around Russia were predisposed to be enemies of Russia. So there were many chances that Russia didn't use to establish a peaceful network around itself. Why and what is the benefit of all that except power is not very clear to me.
So one of modern history's riddles is whether, if the West had resisted Russia and Putin more forcefully in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, subsequent history might have been different. We might never have gotten into this really quite dangerous war in Ukraine. What's your judgment? Do you think the West made a mistake in not intervening more aggressively to make clear that this behavior was unacceptable in 2008?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to remake history. It's always a very complicated thing to do. But of course, I think that if the West had been clearer in its denunciation, because there was nothing much more that the West would have been doing at that time, in 2008 in Georgia, or in 2014 at the time of invasion of Crimea, maybe the calculations again of Russia today would have been different. But again, that's planning on rational moves by the Russian leadership, and we don't know whether it's true that these decisions are rational, or whether they belong to a different tradition of Russia that goes before even the Soviet Union and dates back to the Russian Empire and the way it was also behaving and conducted its policy towards all the different peoples around it. When you think about the fact that most of the ethnies that were inhabiting the Caucasus at the time when the Empire of Russia was moving south, were practically exterminated. That is a lesson of history also that we have not learned.
Let me ask you, Madam President, about the future. Georgia aspires to be a member of both the European Union and NATO. The European Union process seems to be moving forward. Georgia just recently received a membership questionnaire from the EU. Tell us about the significance of that and what you hear from EU leaders about how the process is going to go forward, and how fast Georgia's admission might be possible if there's support.
I think it's very extraordinary, and it shows that in many times that in times of crisis and tragedies, there are at the same times new opportunities that present themselves. And this is the case in the case of the European Union, with this new disposition, I would say, of the European leadership, both nations and the leadership of the Commission and the Council, to open this, what I would call an accelerated path towards the European Union. We still do not know what it contains exactly, what would be the process itself. But I think that it means, and what I've heard, it means that it's a new, more political approach rather than the very bureaucratic, procedural approach that existed before, and that would allow for those three countries, and I think it also includes the Western Balkans, to become more quickly what Mrs. von der Leyen called to be one of us. Whether the one of us means full membership or different type of membership, or exactly what it entails and when, that clearly is not yet fully decided. But that means that there is a new chance, and that means for us that we have to be ready to prepare ourselves and to do some of the things that maybe we have not been rapid enough and effective enough in doing. And I'm talking about the reform of the judicial system, all of these profound reforms that will consolidate the democracy. And that means it's a new impetus for doing that, which I think is a very great chance for my country.
And if I understand you, Madam President, you're saying that some a quick form of transitional or associate membership on the way to a full-time total membership of the European Union would be attractive to Georgia if that was a possibility.
I think anything that means that we're moving forward, and that we're moving forward politically, that there is a new attitude of the European leaders towards this country, understanding that we cannot be all the time outside and waiting for a perspective that these past years was like the horizon moving. As we were approaching, it was moving further. So I think that if we want to keep these populations aboard, and I want to remind that in Georgia, Georgian population has been supportive of this European Union perspective and membership adhesion at 80%, and it has not changed over the years. But at some point in time, there is clearly, and especially when threats are gathering around us, there is a need, and there is a need to be considered as one of us as soon as possible.
And let me ask finally, with the remaining time we have, about Georgia's desire for NATO membership. Georgia's request has been pending. NATO gave it initial indications of support, but that was a long time ago. And there's some who think that this is not in the realm of real possibility. I want to ask you what you're hearing from NATO leaders about Georgia's desire for membership. And secondly, it appears that Sweden and Finland will soon be on a fast track to membership of NATO, assuming they apply, and I think the likelihood is that they will. What would Georgia think if they got in quickly and you didn't?
Well, that's not a competition between any of those countries. I think that our wish to join NATO has been made very clear. It's very clear that for countries like us, the issue of security, and even more so after what is happening in Ukraine, the issue of security, of being protected one way or the other, is becoming even more important, especially when it is clear that Russia is not today or tomorrow, changing its stance and accepting to consider its neighbors as partners, as equal partners, and as countries whose territories have not to be invaded. So the quest for security will not change. We do not know what the NATO leaders and the NATO organization will decide. The Madrid summit, pretty in the coming weeks, will be a very important step to show us what is the thinking in NATO, but the wish of Georgia, and I think I'm clearly speaking also for Ukraine, is to get more security and not less security.
So, Madam President, thank you for clear, forceful answers across a range of topics. We're very grateful to you for joining us today, especially meaningful on the day that Washington said farewell to former Secretary of State Albright. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So please join us here at Washington Post Live for our future programming. Go to our website, WashingtonPostLive.com, to look at the programs that we've got scheduled. Register for the ones that interest you. We'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.